Recently we did a video on Next.auth, which is an authentication solution for Next.js. I want to look at something quite similar, and that's Clerk in this video. Now Clerk is popular for user management, and you can see the page that we have open here. It provides a suite of embeddable UIs, flexible APIs and admin dashboards to authenticate and manage your users. So that's very useful in applications. You want to often offload the management of users and authentication to a service like Clerk. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at how to do that with Next.js in this video. And as well as setting that up, we're also going to look at how to create protected routes in a Next.js application, and also how to get user and session data into our Next.js and React components using Clerk. Before we get started, for the Python users and Django users amongst us, I've got this series which we're now releasing with NetNinja, and that's an amazing YouTube channel for web development in general. There's going to be new videos dropping every day on testing in Django, and for example the last video here is on the unit test module. So check that out, we've got a link in the description and also in the top comment. Let's get back to Clerk. Now we're going to use this with Next.js, so what I want to do here is set up a Next project. So we've got the documentation on Next.js installation here. I'm going to leave a link to that below the video, and we can use this command npx create next app in order to actually create an application. So I've got a prompt open here, and I'm going to paste that command in order to actually create this Next.js application, and we'll add Clerk to that later on. So let's go through this. What we are going to call this is next-clerk, and let's call this next clerk demo. And we're going to select no to TypeScript. I don't want to use that. And we will use ESLint and Tailwind CSS. And we'll use the source directory and the app router pattern. And I'm going to keep the defaults for all of the other options. And that's then going to install all of the dependencies for Next.js and React, as well as Tailwind CSS and the other options that we configured. Now while that is installing, let's go back to the Clerk page here. And at the top, I'm going to go to the documentation. And if we go down here to the frameworks that are supported, you can see that you can use Clerk with Next.js, React, Remix, as well as things like Astro as well. And you can also use it with React Native if you're developing mobile applications. And this can also be used on the server side with Node and Express, as well as Ruby on Rails. And there are SDKs as well. Now if we go to the Quick Start, which is just at the top here, we can look at the Next.js Quick Start here, and we're going to have a look at the basics of what Clerk will provide. And first of all, of course, we need to install Clerk, and we can do that with this npm install command. Let's grab that command and go back to this page here. You can see it's generated our application. So if we ls this directory, we can then cd into that directory, and this is where the package.json file is. I'm going to paste the npm install command into this directory, and that will also install the Clerk Next.js package. Now once we've got this, we can open it in VS Code, and I've got the code command on the terminal in order to do that. So we now have this new Next.js project open in VS Code, and we can start developing this and using Clerk in the application. Now if we go back to the documentation, I'm going to go to section 4 here, and that's where we add what's called the ClerkProvider to the application, and also components from the Clerk SDK. Now the ClerkProvider is going to wrap the application and provide an active session and user context to Clerk's hooks and other components. And you can see some of the pre-built components here, for example signed in. Any children of the signed in component will only be seen when the user is signed in. We also have a signed out component as well. And we also have some buttons here as well. For example, this user button will show the signed in user's avatar. And the sign in button will be an unstyled component that links to the Clerk sign in page. We're going to see all of this in action later on, but you can see the structure of the application here. We surround everything with this ClerkProvider. And then within that, we can use these components. For example, this signed out component. When the user is signed out, they will see the sign in button. And then we have a signed in component. Anything within that will only be shown to authenticated users, for example, the user profile button. And we're going to build this out very soon. Now on the left-hand side, we've got a section on setting up Clerk. So before you integrate Clerk, you actually need to create an account and set up a new application in the Clerk dashboard. So I'm going to sign into the Clerk dashboard now. And you can see from before, I had an application called Clerk Demo when I was preparing this content, which was 2 months ago. Yes, I'm quite slow to record these. Let's create this application again. I'm going to call this Clerk-Demo, and we'll give it the number 2. Now, when you create this, you have some sign-in options here. For example, do you want to allow the user to sign in by email, by phone number, or by social providers such as Google and Facebook? What I'm going to do is leave the defaults ticked here. So we're going to select user and Google. And after you do that, you can create the application. And that takes you to this page here where you select your front-end framework, for example, Next.js. And you then have these easy to use steps to actually add Clerk to the application. We've already installed the npm package, And now we are going to set some environment variables in the .env.local file. So we're going to go to this API keys page in Clerk's dashboard, and we're going to set up these API keys so we can use them in the Next.js application. And you can see this is a very developer-friendly experience. We can quickly copy what we need here, and then if we go back to the Next.js application, in this root directory we can create the .env.local file and paste those values in. So we set two environment variables, next public clerk publishable key and the clerk secret key. Once we've done that, let's go back to the documentation here on setting this up with Next.js. And what we can do now is update middleware.ts. So we create this middleware file at the root of the project or in the source directory. So we have the source directory here. Let's create a file called middleware.js. We're not using TypeScript, remember. But if you are using TypeScript, you can create a .ts file here. And we're going to copy the contents of this middleware and we're going to paste it into this file. Now we're importing something called Clerk Middleware here. And if we go back to this page here, you can see this line here. The Clerk Middleware helper will enable authentication, and that's where you'll configure your protected routes. So in a Next.js application, some of the routes can be public, but if you have authentication, you want to protect some resources, some pages in the application. And you do this by making them essentially a protected route, and this Clerk Middleware is how you actually do that. Now if we go back to VS Code, this config.matcher, this is a JavaScript array that's going to tell Clerk which routes to run the Clerk middleware for. So we have two options here from the documentation. The first one is telling it to skip Next.js internals and also skip all static files unless they're found in the search parameters. And the second one here is telling Next.js we always want to run the Clerk middleware for authentication when we have API routes in the application. Now by default, Clerk middleware is not going to protect any routes, so all routes are public in the application, and you must opt in to protection for routes. We're going to see how to configure that very soon in this video, but let's go back to the documentation for now, and we're going to add the ClerkProvider to the application. And for app router Next.js apps, this has been added here to layout.tsx. So what we're going to do is go back to VS Code, and let's go to the app directory, and we have a layout file here. And if we scroll down here, you can see the root HTML tag. We're going to surround all of the content here in the ClerkProvider. So let's go back to this page and we're going to bring the imports in here and let's add them to the top of this file here. So we're going to import a bunch of objects from Clerk, including the ClerkProvider. And then if we scroll back down here, we can surround everything here in this return statement in the ClerkProvider. So I'm going to tab over the HTML element and we can close off that ClerkProvider at the bottom. Once we've added that, if we go back to the documentation again, in the body tag, we have these components. So for example, the signed out component, that basically says whatever's inside this component should be shown to signed out users. And then we have the opposite here for signed in. What I want to do is just copy all of this. So we're going to copy these and let's bring them into this application. So in the body tag here, I'm just going to surround these in an HTML header tag and we can paste these in. And I'm going to tab them over again here and fix the indentation. So for signed out users, we want to show the sign in button to allow them to actually authenticate and sign into the application. And for signed in users, we want to show them this user button as we're about to see on the user interface. Now we need to run this application. So I'm going to load up the integrated terminal on VS Code. And inside this directory, we can run npm run dev in order to start the server. And then we can view this page on the browser. So we're now on this page and the server is running. And you can see at the top left, we have this sign in button and it's unstyled by default. And the rest of the content on this page is just the defaults from Create Next App. You can remove that if you want. I'm going to click this sign in button. And when we click the button, you can see we're taken to this page here and we have two options. And that's the options we configured on the Clerk dashboard. We can sign up with our email address or we can continue using the Google provider here. I'm going to do that. I'm going to select continue with Google. And I have an email address here. I'm going to select that and sign up with this email address. And then we can click continue here. And you can see something is in progress at the moment. And that redirects us back to this page here. And you can see the user profile button at the top left. And this button gives us some information such as the fact that we're signed in and the ability to manage our account and also sign out of the application. And if I click sign out here, you can see we are redirected back and now we can see the sign in link. So we can now very, very easily authenticate and log out of this Next.js application. And that whole process is managed by Clerk. Now, what's actually happened here? Let's go back to the dashboard at Clerk. And at the top here, you can see we have a section on users. If I click that, you can see my user is now present on this dashboard. So the user whose email address I used to sign up with Google is now present here. They've joined the application. And the management of this user is done through Clerk itself. And you can see we can also create users on the dashboard just by clicking that button, and we can provide an email and default password. So that's another way we can create users, for example, internal users in the application. So I want to just do that very quickly. I'm going to create a user here called user1@test.com, and I'm going to use a very generic password of test here. It won't allow you to do that by default, but you can ignore password policies in order to create this user. So now we have a user with a terrible password that's available, and we can log in with that user on our application. So let's go back to the application and click the sign in button. And this time we want to sign up with our user. So it's user1@test.com. And then when we sign up with an email, or rather when we sign in with an email, we are going to be taken to the password page. So it's not social authentication with Google. This time we actually need to enter a password. Now the password was test, and if we click continue here, we're actually getting this message here. The password has been found as part of a breach. So I'm going to try changing this now. So let's go back to the dashboard, and for user 1 we can actually change the password. So if I view this profile, we have an option here to change the password, and I'm going to set this to something a bit more secure here. When we click change password, that's going to be changed for that user. So again, we have this user management in Clerk. We can then go back to our application, and if we go back here, we can enter the new password for this user and click continue, and hopefully this is going to log us in now. And that's worked. We now have our user here at the top, and we can again sign out using this button here, and that'll take us back to this page. So I hope this is making sense, and we can style this using Tailwind because we did select that Tailwind should be added as part of this application. What I'm also going to do is add a sign out button at the top. So if we look at this just now, we can sign in with our users. For example, I can sign in with this Gmail account. But to sign out, we need to click the user profile button and then click this sign out link. But we can actually embed a sign out link at the top here if you wanted to put that, for example, directly into a navbar. So what we can do here is go back to VS Code, and I'm going to import the signed out button at the top, and that's sign out button. We can import that, and then we can use that in the application. Now we only want to show a sign out button when the user is signed in. So we can put this alongside the user button, and I'm going to do that here. And then we can go back to the application, and you can see if we refresh this, we have the sign out button here directly at the top. And again, as I mentioned, we are using Tailwind here. So we can create a div here with some classes, for example, using Flexbox, and justify between is going to push that content to each side of the page. And let's add some margin in general here of 2. And we can then move our 2 buttons here into that div. So I'm going to paste these in here, and we can go back to the page and have a look at that page. You can see now that the sign out is on the right hand side, and that will allow us to directly sign out of the application. Now you might have noticed this error here, and that's because I've used class instead of class name. So in React and Next applications, we need to use class name, and that's because this is a JavaScript app and class is a reserved keyword. So at this stage in the application, what we can do is sign in, and then once we're signed in, we can sign out via the user profile button, and we can manage the account on that button as well. And we now have directly embedded here a sign out button at the top right. And after we do sign in and sign up, Clerk is going to manage these users for us. I want to move on now and look at protecting routes in a Next.js application. So to do that, I'm going to go to a page on Clerk Middleware. So I'm on this page now on the Clerk middleware, and remember we did add this to the middleware.js file, and we can configure that middleware using this matcher here. So we're now going to learn to configure this and protect some routes in the Next.js application. So you can protect routes by checking either or both of the following. You can check if the user is signed in or not, and you can also use authorization status, and that's going to check whether the user has the required role or permission. We're going to stick with using the authentication status. So let's look at this section below here. Now there are 2 methods we can use here for this. We can use the auth.protect method, and that will be used to redirect unauthenticated users to the sign-in route automatically. And you can also use auth.userid here if you want to have more control over what your app does based on the user authentication status. We're going to stick with auth.protect, and we're going to use this helper function here called createRouteMatcher. And that's a Clerk function that's going to allow you to protect multiple routes. This accepts an array of these routes, and it checks if the route that the user is trying to visit in the application matches one of these. Now createRouteMatcher is going to return a function here called isProtectedRoute, and you can then call that function in your middleware. As you can see here, it's called within this if statement. So this Clerk middleware here is going to have access to the request object, and it can check that request object and pass it as a parameter to isProtectedRoute. And if that evaluates to true, then you know that the route is protected. And what you can then do is call the auth.protect method, and that's going to redirect the user to the sign in page. Now what I'm going to do is just copy all of this code here, and let's go back to middleware.js, and I'm going to paste this into the top of the file. So now we're importing create_routematcher, and we're going to change what's passed to the create_routematcher function here. So the array that we're passing of different routes, we're going to customize that in a second. But in a nutshell, this create_routematcher is going to return that this is protected route function, and we are using that within the Clerk middleware here. And the fact that this redirects is going to stop the request chain. So if a user tries to access a protected route, they're not going to be able to get access to that, because this middleware is going to be responsible for redirecting them when they access that particular route. Now, before we add the routes to this, we need to have a page that we can actually protect. So what we're going to do is go to the app directory on the left-hand side, and let's create a folder in here called secret. And inside there, we can use the Next.js convention here, and we're going to create a page.js file. So if you're using the app router, this is how we do this file-based routing. Within the app directory, you can define any number of subdirectories, and these represent routes by default in the application. So let's go to page.js, and let's create a very simple component here called secret that returns an h1 tag with the text, "This is secret content." So at the moment, this page can be accessed by anyone. So if we go back to our application here and we add /secret at the top, you can see that we're going to get back the h1 tag here. Now we want to protect this, and let's assume we want to make sure that only users that are authenticated can visit this route. Let's go back to Next.js, and let's go back to middleware.js, and we're going to pass that route into the create_routematcher function. So let's add /secret into this, and if we save this and go back to our application and try this again, when we refresh the secret page here, you can see that we're now redirected to the sign-in page. So the redirection happens here because we have this middleware. So the request comes in, and that request is accessible as a parameter to this middleware. And then this create_routematcher returns an isProtectedRoute function. We pass the request into that, and that function will then return true or false, depending on whether the given route is protected. And if the route is protected and we're not logged in, what's going to happen here is we are redirected, as you saw there, to the sign-in page. So we can very easily protect different route patterns in our Next.js applications just by using Clerk and this route matcher. Now I want to show something from the documentation just before we move on. So let's go back to this page on the Clerk middleware. If you want to protect routes based on user authorization status, there's a section here on that. So basically you can check if the user has the required roles or permissions. And again, there are two methods you can use. Auth.protect if you want Clerk to return a 404 if the user does not have the role or the permission. And we also have auth.has if you want more granular control over what the app does based on the authorization status. If we look at the example here using the auth.protect method, again, it's the same pattern here. We have a route matcher that returns the isProtectedRoute function, and we use that within the middleware. And if it is a protected route, you can await auth.protect. And if you pass the callback into that, you can then check whether the user has the given permissions, and that can then determine whether you give the user access to the page or not. So now we're at this stage in the application where we can log into the application, and we also have a protected route in the application. So just to demonstrate that this is going to work when we log in, let's log in with this user, and if I continue here, we can see we now get access to the secret page. But I want to now show how we can use Clerk to access user data within a component. So Clerk provides a set of hooks and helper functions that you can use to access the active session and user data in your Next.js application. So I'm going to go to the documentation on this, and I'm going to paste this at the top, and there's links to this just below the video. If you want to read user data and session data in the Next.js application, let's see how to do that now. Now, of course, in Next.js, the modern versions at least, we have the idea of server components and client components. So it depends where you want to read this data. If you want to read it server side, then there are two app router specific helpers you can use, and that's the auth helper and the current user helper. So what do these return? Let's see now. The auth helper is going to return an auth object with the currently active user, whereas the current user helper here is going to return the backend user object of that currently active user. So let's actually see an example of this just to demonstrate it. I think it will make more sense when we actually use these. So I'm going to import these two things into our secret component here. So let's go back to this secret page, and at the top here, let's bring in that import. So we're importing auth and current user, and we're now going to use these just at the end of this video within the component. So I'm going to create a variable here called auth data, and we can call this auth helper function here in order to get access to that. Now before we do anything else, let's just console log this auth data. So if we go back to the browser and go to the developer tools, you can see we have a promise here. Now in order to resolve that, of course, we need to await this function. So let's do that just now, and we need to make this an async function here. So let's add the async keyword, and let's try this again. If we go back to the page here, it's going to refresh, and you can see we have a variety of data here. We have a user ID and a session ID for that user's session. And we have a bunch of other information here as well, such as session claims. What I'm going to do is assume that we want to get the user ID out of this data. What we can do is just go back here, and rather than getting the whole object of data, we can actually get the user ID here just by using this syntax. And we can then print that to the terminal, and that's going to just print the user ID to the console here, as you can see at the top. Now we can get more detailed information by using the other function, and that was the current user function. So I'm going to copy this line of code in order to get the backend user object. And we can go back to VS Code here, and let's paste that in here, and we're going to get back a user that we can then console log. So we're calling current user here, we're awaiting that response, and then we are printing out the data we get back to the console. Let's go back to our application again and look at this data here. So now we get some information about that backend API user. So we have basic information here, for example, the name of the user, whether the user has an image, the ID of that user, and also things like the surname and the timestamp when that user last signed in. So I want to change this page up here, and I want to show the user first name here. So I'm going to show that in this header tag. So let's go back to VS Code, and let's change what's in the header tag here. This is secret content for, and then we're going to reference the user that we have here. And if that user has resolved, we can then access the first name property in order to print that to the page. So let's go back here, and you can see we get this content at the top. When I refresh this, you can see it is there by default as well. So we are authenticated, and that authentication session is going to persist when you refresh the page, and all of the data that Clerk has on the back end for these users are available through these two functions. So that's all for this video. In this video, we've shown how to very easily create authentication in our Next.js applications using Clerk, and we've shown how easy it is to set up protected routes and to access user data, such as session data and user information, inside our components. And of course, there's more that we can do here. For example, if we are not using server components, we can look at the client-side documentation, and there's a hook here called useAuth. So if you need to access the current authentication state on the client side, you can use the useAuth hook. If you want to know more about this, check out the documentation that's linked in the description of the video. But that's going to be all for this video. If you found this content helpful and you want to support the channel, check out the Ko-fi page we've got in the description. And thanks very much to everybody that's contributed to that. It's greatly appreciated. And if you have any more requests for other Next.js content, or for example Clerk content, or any other kind of tools that are similar, let me know in the comments as well. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.